Hello, everybody, and welcome to this HFW podcast on operational safety and risk issues arising from the aerospace industry's emergence and recovery from the Covid-19 epidemic. My name is Ed Spencer. I'm a partner in HFW's aerospace team in London, and I'm joined by Paul Woodley, also a partner in our team in London. We are delighted to be joined by our special guest, Dai Whittingham, who is currently chairman of the UK Flight Safety Committee following a very distinguished career as a pilot in the RAF. Dai, a very warm welcome.
Good morning.
Tell us a bit about the UK Flight Safety Committee. What are its functions and what are its objectives?
Well, it came out of a transport safety body that the government set up back in the 50s. So the committee in its current form has been running since 1961. It exists to further commercial aviation safety as its general principle. So it's an unincorporated association of professionals. The membership ranges from BA and Virgin at the heavy, and Emirates at the heavy end of the market. So we do take overseas airlines down through TUI, Ryanair, Aer Lingus, EasyJet, some business operators, onshore, offshore, rotary, all the way down to London's Air Ambulance. And the military are also involved, a huge amount of crossover because the sky is the same regardless of the markings on the outside of your aircraft. So also involved, and we are part sponsored by the CAA, NATS, the ANSP, the service provider, is also a member, the UK Airprox board, and the confidential human factors reporting program, Air Accident Investigation Branch, and some general aviation interests as well. So we run right the way across the full gamut of aviation activity, and much of the activity involves sharing of information so that we learn from each other's incidents, errors, and whatever. And as aviation gets safer, and it is massively safe at the moment, the standards are exceptional, that you have fewer incidents and accidents to talk about. So it's important that we share the learning wherever we can.
Thank you, Dai, and pleasure to finally meet you, albeit virtually, so good morning. Just really moving on, I mean, as HFW, we have certainly embarked on a journey, as we all are, and we're all facing challenges arising out of COVID-19. But what I'm really interested in, and I think our audience will be interested in, is from your perspective, and certainly your role, is based on the conversations that you've had directly with the industry, what are the biggest challenges, and ultimately, how is the industry, whether that's airlines, airports, manufacturers, how are they coping with these challenges? So I'm just really curious to get your kind of inside scoop, so to speak.
Well, the simple answer is with great difficulty, because the constraints provided by the various national responses to COVID-19 have an impact on the way people go about their business. And of course, the activity levels have dropped hugely. And we're all, I think, aware of the general drawdown in aviation. That's a big issue on the business side, never mind anything else. But of course, there are issues such as currency or recency, depending what you want to call it, for maintaining skills. And it's very simple. If you think about not driving your car for 2 or 3 weeks, you get back in it, and it's not quite as familiar as it was when you're driving it every day. So the same is true, and it's not necessarily the physical handling skills that come to grief. It can be the high technical merit issues where the other considerations that a competent crew would be thinking about tend to go by the wayside. So it's not saying it's unsafe, it's just reducing some of the safety barriers, that the awareness for a few days can be different. And I well remember from my time, certainly flying fighters, where if I had 2 weeks leave, I would notice when I got back in the cockpit again that things weren't quite at the right edge, for maybe a couple of trips, and thereafter you're back into it. So there is that. There is also the difficulty of maintaining licensing, medicals, and so on. With no aircraft to fly, you're clearly reliant on the simulators. The simulator capacity is set up to run with initial training, the odd bit of recurrent training and checking, but it's not set up to deal with the huge volume of people who actually could use going flying in a simulator on a monthly basis or whatever. And of course, it's a cost to the airline. So they will do what simulator training they need to do to comply with requirements. It's all evidence-based, but what they don't necessarily have, especially at the moment in the current commercial climate, is the finance to be able to just give people free simulators to keep them up to speed. It's easier for them to furlough people and then bring them back on later in the day. And there are issues with doing that as well.
So just picking up on that a bit, Dai, I mean, we've obviously seen a huge reduction in passenger operations, upward of 90% reductions, certainly in this country. And you mentioned that pilots and other personnel, ATC staff, for example, don't have the opportunity that they've had in the past to practice their skills. I think people will be interested to know what actually can they do. At the moment, you talk about simulators, but simulators, I suppose, can only go so far, and you can only get so much access to a simulator. Is the reality of the situation that when things start to return to normal and pilots go back on the line, are they going to be under-practiced in a material way, and is this going to increase the risk profile?
They are likely to be under-practiced. There are things that you can do. There are part-task trainers. Some people will be getting their heads in the books and reminding themselves. Some people will be thinking about it. Others won't. That's a personal issue, and it's up to the operators, and of course there is regulatory oversight of this. It's up to the operators to make sure that their pilots are sufficiently skilled when they conduct a revenue flight. So ways of doing that, you can put people onto the jump seat to just remind themselves about the environment. Clearly they're going to be into the simulators because there is a regulatory requirement for a certain number of takeoffs and landings in a given period. It varies across the globe, but typically you would expect somebody to have done 3 takeoffs, 3 landings or whatever in the previous 90 days. That is the sort of issue where you might have to put base training on that. So you've basically got a non-revenue flight with a lot of pilots on board just bouncing off a runway somewhere. That costs you money. And at the moment, of course, all the operators are bleeding resource.
We've recently seen a very horrible tragedy down in Karachi involving a PIA A320. What do you know about that accident, and do you think that out-of-practice pilots could have been a factor in what happened over there?
I only know what has been put into the public domain in terms of the fact that it was clearly an unstable approach, and it appears all the evidence points to the fact that they did not have the undercarriage down, which was going to affect, therefore, some of the warnings they'd have got from the ground proximity system, which would have said caution terrain or warning terrain, not caution gear or too low gear. It's the too low terrain, too low gear. So, and that would cue different things in your brain. I'm not too low for the terrain. I can see the runway in front of me. So there will be a question, I think, about what was going on the flight deck. The cockpit voice recorders have been downloaded, I understand, and that is going to give the investigators a great deal of information. I'm not sure whether it's going to be down to lack of recency or other human factors, cultural issues, whatever they may be. but it's apparent that this crew pressed on with what was an unstable approach with pretty disastrous consequences. I think it's telling that Airbus has not seen fit to take any action with regards to the rest of the A320 fleet, which says that the manufacturer is confident that it was not the aircraft involved, that it's more of a handling crew issue. But that's an inference drawn from their inactivity. If there was a problem, clearly they would have dealt with it. There would have been bulletins and all sorts. That's not happened, which points towards the crew, sadly.
Sure. Let's talk about maintenance, Paul.
Yeah, interesting. So we've talked about, I guess, the human element and personnel readiness, which is going to be a significant challenge. But really moving to the other side of the fence, as we touched upon, albeit loosely, is maintenance. We've all seen in the news the grounding of aircraft, and it's that aggregation of those aircraft in any one location, which is a significant concern, certainly to the regulators and indeed insurance industry. And maintenance is key. I mean, how successful have, from your experience and the observations and conversations that you had, how successful have the airlines and indeed the airports been in maintaining these aircraft whilst they've been on the ground, whether it's short-term or long-term storage programs? And what have been the biggest challenges that you've seen so far arising out of this prolonged period of inactivity, certainly in the context of COVID, with access to aircraft, furloughing of key staff, and generally the financial implications and the cost to store these aircraft?
Yeah, and some of the challenges has been as simple as ramp passes expiring and the passes and permits office being shut. Something as simple as that can trip you up. The first thing is that whatever the aircraft type, the maintenance manual lays down the processes that you need to follow for any form of storage. And depending on the length of storage will depend on the depth of the maintenance activities you have to do to both store and de-store an aircraft. So there was huge uncertainty when people first started with this. How long do you store? And if you are really pressed for revenue, it could be quite tempting to just roll aircraft from a short-term storage into a short-term storage into a short-term storage, which actually is outside the manual, and it means that you're not taking the appropriate precautions. So it's simple things. There are anti-deterioration processes that go on with engines, and even piston engines. Do you run? Sometimes they like to be run. Sometimes the manufacturers say don't run them. What do you do? Insects getting into static vents, birds building nests in intakes, various, not just engine intakes, but air scoops and all the rest of it. If there's a hole there, an animal's going to try and find its way into it. Some parts of the world clearly more of a problem than others. And the simple stuff like the tyres. You park a heavy aircraft and leave it, the tyres tend to flat spot. Oleos leak, hydraulic systems weep. Aircraft like being flown. They're a bit like racehorses in that respect. You need to keep them busy. And similarly, when you bring them out of storage, there is a process that you have to follow. And sometimes the manufacturer will say, okay, you now need to do a flight check. And then you have another question which says, so who does the flight check? Because actually it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Do you know what you're looking for? Do you have the right processes for a very detailed inspection? What's the handover between the maintainers and the operators? There are a number of considerations that come in. And of course, the other thing with maintenance, it's just like on the flight deck or being in the cabin, is that the processes that you go through in terms of defect rectification and so on, you're suddenly not doing anymore because the aircraft aren't flying. So you get less hands-on experience, or you get out of the routine. And a lot of these processes rely on a routine, a standard operating procedure where I'm going to go over here, I'm going to get the manual, I'm going to go over there and get the toolkit. This is the process for stores. And sometimes those little, I'm going to check the part numbers before I put it on the aircraft. Sometimes those little things can fall out if you don't stick to a routine. So there is an element of risk there, and that's down to vocalizing it and ensuring you understand it from the operator's level, that your maintenance teams are doing what you think they're doing, and that you've got the right level of oversight. And of course, we're back to the commercial pressures, which is often about the numbers of people you've got. And we can talk about redundancies for flight crew in a minute, but a number of operators, a number of airports have stripped people out of their safety departments on the basis that the workload isn't there. Well, actually, the safety risk with this current environment is slightly higher than it would normally be. Now is perhaps not the time to be doing that. So we've been encouraging the regulators across the globe to make sure that operators have effective safety resources, not sufficient. We're not declaring numbers. We're just saying make sure that the operators have effective safety resources in place.
You mentioned regulators. Very interesting to look at it from their perspective. What do you know about what the CAA have been doing to assist airlines in resuming operations? I mean, obviously, airlines have just been going through a most terrible situation. And I just wonder whether the CAA, for example, in this country have been trying to help them by perhaps relieving them of some of their stricter obligations, whether there's even scope for that.
There is scope for it, and the UK CAA has been very forward-leaning. It's been good to see. So, for example, extensions on license checks, extensions on medicals, waivers on some requirements, because it can be as simple as dangerous goods, where you would expect somebody dealing with dangerous goods for air carriage to have a certain level of checking and auditing and so on. Where you've not been able to do that because of COVID-19, the regulator has been issuing a waiver. Now, the waiver doesn't say, yeah, don't worry about it. It says you have a problem, and we want to know about your plan for getting your people checked, and we'd like to see it done by this stage. So typically they've been offering 3 or 4 month extensions on some of the specific requirements. The FAA in the States issued waivers, provided the operator asked, for cabin crew doing the pre-flight takeoff brief, the pre-flight brief, the safety equipment brief. So that actually you're just putting them at risk with proximity to passengers and putting masks over their faces and all the rest of it. So we're going to take the risk for the next few months that you're not going to need to do this. And instead you encourage people to read the safety cards. So there are ways that the regulator can ease things, and our regulator in this country has been doing just that. It's issued a considerable volume of guidance, waivers, and so on. What we are looking at now, of course, there is the guidance that's just come out from DFT, the Department of Transport, on hand baggage. Excuse me. So hand baggage is a source of conflict, and you only have to think about the last time you flew short haul and the scrum that happens on boarding and on arrival, with people wrestling bags out of overheads. And so there's an issue there where you end up maybe moving somebody else's bag to make sure you can get your own in, and the next thing is you've got conflict. So minimizing cabin baggage is a good thing. Unfortunately, some operators charge for it. So You're now telling passengers, if you've got to check this bag in, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you another 50 whatevers. That's a difficulty. And the other issue is lithium batteries. So lithium batteries are a real source of risk in the air. And in the run-up to the pandemic, the USA, as I understand it, was having about one lithium battery fire in the air every week. Now, all those have been in the cabin because they tended to be from phones, but there are plenty of issues where laptops have cooked off, power packs have cooked off, thermal runaway, and you got a fire. You can fight a fire in the cabin. You can't fight it in the hold with most airlines. So we're now saying you're going to put all your laptops, your cameras, and everything else into the hold. There are limits that are in place. The IATA dangerous goods limit, which is 160 watt hours, is the absolute limit. If your lithium battery or whatever capacity is over that, you may not take it into the air. If it's below 100, you can carry it without any difficulty, but it should be in the cabin unless it's specially prepared. And if it's over 100, between the 100 and 160, then it's got to be in the cabin so you can fight the fire. So what we don't seem to have done yet is close off that loophole which says, sorry, you're not taking something over 100 watt hours on board, full stop, whether it's in checked baggage or in the cabin.
Okay, so just kind of trying to bring it all together, really, and drawing upon your experience and your knowledge. What would you regard as the biggest threats and risks to aviation safety in the medium to short to medium term, let's say, arising out of the COVID-19 epidemic?
In the short term, it's probably loss of routine, loss of currency, so that things become unfamiliar. And that's true for example, for air traffic controllers, that you can't just step in and control a maxed out sector as if nothing had happened, when all you've had to do is talk to half a dozen airplanes over the previous 3 hours. The previous 3 weeks, you get the picture. You have to work up to it, and it's the same reason the Formula One drivers have free practice days. It gets them back up to speed. So I think that's that, and the commercial threat, the redundancies are having an impact. So one of the known error mechanisms in human performance is distraction. Distraction is known to cause errors. It's why most operators have run a sterile concept, a cockpit concept below 10,000 feet. So below 10,000 feet, the requirement will be for pilots to discuss only those things absolutely pertinent to the flight itself. So you're not going to be talking about the food, the hotel, the transport. You're not going to be talking about politics, football, anything else. And now we put them in a situation where they don't know whether they're still going to have a job when they get back to base, or they've been told that they're vulnerable to a redundancy program. It is a distraction. What you can't say is that it's such a distraction that people are going to be unsafe. But what you can say is, I think, that distractions of that sort are likely to contribute to error mechanisms. So if, for example, one pilot enters the wrong data into the flight management computer and it's picked up by the cross-check from the other pilot, is that distraction related? Is that currency related? Is it just a normal error and the barriers work, the safety nets have worked, and that error has been trapped? Can you prove that it was distraction? No, you can't. So it's just something for people to be aware of. And the same comes true of reporting. So aviation safety relies heavily, the regulation and oversight relies on data, on the reporting of incidents, of technical defects and so on. Where people are concerned that they may be held accountable for errors, or whether they will be held accountable for just having more reports in the system than anybody else, the tendency is that they may not report to the same level. And we saw that with a UK operator some years ago, which had a redundancy program where their reporting rate dropped to 10% of previous levels. So they just weren't getting the information they needed. And that is a concern, and it's particularly a concern where the operators who are making redundancies are not completely clear about what conditions, what considerations they are giving when they select people. And I was hearing tell the other day of one individual who has since been made redundant, high performing, no issues, never been in any form of difficulty for his performance with aircraft, but he did have a month off with an ear infection last year, and that was enough to get him the bullet. So when you have those sorts of threats to livelihood, you will get a different response. And if you now look at the entry level to the system, where you've got youngsters coming out of the training schools with a personal debt of up to £150,000 or more for their license and their type rating, and you now say, oh, I'm not feeling awfully well. According to my license, I shouldn't fly, but if I don't fly, I don't get paid, or if I don't fly, I'm likely to be made redundant and therefore have no way of paying off my debt. You can see the pressures that then start to develop, which may lead to people operating when they're not fit, or when they're fatigued, or whatever. So a number of pressures that people just need to be aware of, I think.
Thank you, Dai. Sadly, we've come to the end of our time for this podcast, but that really was an absolutely fascinating insight in relation to a lot of the operational considerations that are taking place on the ground and at the coalface. Some fairly grim realities there, of course. By the same token, we all hope that we can emerge from this crisis stronger and better, although I think we all probably realise it's going to be quite a long process. So thanks again for your time, much appreciated, and thank you everybody for listening.